So we'll get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lian Chen. I am Assistant Professor of Chinese and International Affairs, and I'm also the director of the Taiwan Education and Research Program at the George Washington University. It is my great pleasure to welcome everyone here and also joining us from Zoom for your participation in today's event. So before we begin, I have a few words to share with you about the programming of the Taiwan Education and Research Program, or TERP, at GW. TERP was established in 2004 by Professor Edward McCord to promote and support academic and policy-related study and research on Taiwan. TERP in the recent years has supported the creation of the Taiwan Resource Center at GW's Gelman Library, and has also sponsored policy workshops on the Taiwan affairs, course development, and seminars and lecture events. Today's lecture is part of the Taiwan Humanities Lecture Series, which is a major component of TERP's newly implemented Taiwan Studies Initiative. Through the events and activities organized under the initiative, we hope to enhance holistic understanding of Taiwan's history and its social, economic, political, cultural development, to prepare students, researchers, and policymakers in the greater Washington, D.C. area so that we can prepare them to better engage in Taiwan-related issues globally. Today's event was made possible. It is sponsored by the Taiwan Studies Initiative and also the East Asian National Resource Center at GW. It was made possible because of the hard work of our team, of my dear colleagues at TERP. Some of them I only get to meet first time in person today. So I would like to thank particularly Adam Bubanich, Richard Haddock, and Malene Oliver, and Amanda, and of course, Professor Alexa Alice Jubin for their behind-the-scene efforts. It is a great pleasure of mine to introduce our speaker today, who is going to talk to us about his recently published book. So I have the book here. I'd like to show it to you, just in case you're interested. Of course, you're interested in the book. So if you would like to take a look, you're more than welcome to come here and actually see what's the really rich materials included in the book. So Professor Zhiming Wang is Associate Research Fellow at the Institute of European and American Studies, Academia Sinica, Taipei, Taiwan. Is working in the intersected fields of Trans-Pacific American literature and Inter-Asia cultural studies, especially on the questions of intellectual production and diasporic connections. He's the chief editor of Router, a journal of cultural studies, and the author of Trans-Pacific Articulations, Student Migration and the Remaking of Asian America, which was published in 2013 from the University of Hawaii Press. And during his last visit to GW in 2013, I believe he gave a talk on that particular book. So he gave a talk on Chinese students studying abroad experiences and how those experiences actually shape the path of modernity in the Chinese-speaking areas. So I think you can see the connection here, from your first book to your most recent one. And this book, the book that we will be discussing about today, written in Chinese, was recently published, and its English title is Re-Articulations, 100 Years of Foreign Literature Studies in Taiwan. And the Chinese title is 落地转译，台湾外文研究的版言轨迹。So if you are joining us via Zoom, I'm going to ask Terp's team to post a link to the publisher's site for more information about the book and how you will be able to purchase it. If you are joining us from Zoom, you are invited to share your thoughts, comments, and questions using the chat box. And we will collect those questions and comments and ask them on your behalf during the Q&A session. So I would like you to join me now to give a warm welcome to Dr. Zhiming Wang.
Still not sure whether I should take my mask off. But in any case, I hope you can hear me now. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Liana, for such a generous introduction, and especially the team behind the scene that's made my visit here possible today. I'm really delighted and happy to be here again. As Liana mentioned, 2013, when I had my first book, I had the privilege and pleasure to present the book here. And now very soon, 10 years, well, slightly less than 10 years after, I finally got another baby out here. Not a real baby, but a baby in book form. So I'm also very happy to be here to share the book with you. The talk, I believe, is situated as a sort of a book talk. So what I'm going to do today is really to give you a sense of the book. So I have about two parts of the presentation. The first part is really about a sense of the book as a whole. The second one is actually trying to kind of zoom in onto chapters, which hopefully will offer two different slices into the way foreign literature studies is articulated specifically in the Cold War formation in Taiwan. So this, in a way, would also be a way to sort of think about Taiwan studies, or I should say Taiwan particularly in relation to the kind of Cold War influence, both politically and culturally. So let me backtrack a little bit by talking a little bit about the book. As you probably already know, and I think the title is pretty indicative, that I was trained in this discipline called foreign literature studies in Taiwan up until I got a PhD later on in UC Santa Cruz. And for the longest time, that has always been a very interesting discipline in the sense that we are so taught to learn everything about the West, and yet not really having a sense of our own history, that shaped the formation intellectually and also politically. And so, as a student of foreign literature studies, I've been trying to kind of understand, where is my discipline coming from? If it's not merely, a copy, imitation of the Western, education model, then where other sources of inspiration and intellectual resources discipline actually drew from. And so, as you know, Taiwan was once a colony. It has a strong history with mainland China. So part of the story that formed the discipline is really to kind of look at different locations, particularly Japan, in PRC China. Well, back in the day, it was not so much called the PRC. It was the late Qing China and early Republican China. As a foundation that shaped what foreign literature study came to be in Taiwan in the later years. So let me begin by for those anyone of you recognize these books. These are the textbooks for foreign literature study students if you're admitted into the discipline. These are the books that you have to buy and collect. And sometimes we call them bricks rather than books because they're so heavy to carry. So I think initially, one thing for students, the challenge has always been like, how do we get through these books, right? How do we understand these books? And how do we make sense of their relationship to us, in the here and now in Taiwan? Foreign literature studies is oftentimes understood primarily in Taiwan as a form of English studies, because English is the main language of instruction, although there are also a component of French, Japanese, German, Spanish. It's a second language, second foreign language component to the curriculum. But in terms of literary studies, it's the Anglo-American tradition that is at the core. Therefore, it also has a language teaching unit and increasingly creative writing components. It was greatly informed by the new critical and comparative literature paradigms in the 1960s and 70s, and reshaped in the 1990s by literary theory, cultural studies, and ethnic studies. It is a study of the West in relation to ourselves. So this is really in the gist of what the discipline is in general being perceived. However, some of the questions that remain, and these are some of the questions that the book tries to explore. Why in this exclusive form? Why do we have to all start with Northern anthology? Why can't we start with something else, right? Who told us to actually teach in such a way? Should we, and this becomes strikingly so when I came to study here in the States. Northern anthology was not part of the curriculum, it was something else. So why we stick to this kind of older model and rather than being updated? The other question foreign literature studies contribute to the knowledge about the West, or should it be a critical examination of our own culture, right? Which is a question about what is, the end of the discipline. And more critically, I think, especially since the 1990s, the question of subjectivity, this is one of the topics that we zooming into later on. The question of subjectivity emerged as a question for ourselves. Like, why are we doing this in this way? Right? Is there a historical trajectory for this? Is there a cultural political reason for that? So this is basically what the book is trying to do through working through institutional and intellectual histories. And hence the book cover. The book is very much influenced by these four figures. From the left, Gao Said, the middle, Karatani, and then Stuart Ho, and then Ben Anderson. They all, these are all well-known established figures here in the English department in general literature studies. And they each offer me something to kind of work with this large archive from the late 19th century to the contemporary moment. Basically, with them, traveling theory, colonial modern invention of literature, articulation of West and East, race, nation, history and politics, spectrum comparison. These are some of the terms that these critical scholars have worked with and inform my thinking about what foreign literature studies is. And basically, it seems to me that it's not merely an imitation of the West, but actually an appropriation and a remaking in the local, which I call re-articulation. So I'll explain that a little bit more in the follow. And articulation is the form of connection that can make unity of two different elements. Under certain conditions, it is a linkage which is not necessarily determined, absolute, and essential for all time. You have to ask, under what circumstances can a connection be forged or made? So the so-called unity of a discourse is really the articulation of different distinct elements, which can be re-articulated in different ways because they have no necessary belongingness. This is a quotation from Stuart Ho, which basically argues for a way of looking at theme, either a history or an event, in this case, a discipline, how it has been transferred, across spaces and time, and be reassembled, if you would take the Deleuzian term for that, reassembled for local uses or for local purposes. So by re-articulation, I emphasize the spatial and temporal dimensions in our understanding of the FLS as an unstable unity, because the field itself has also changes and reforms, and the translation of the West and the South. Foreign literature studies is a colonial modern invention. This is obviously taken from Autonomy, and a translingual practice of trouble theory, Said, accompanied by this strategy of comparison, Anderson. So for the foreign to be a force in the space of change, it must ground itself in the local to render meanings anew. This is basically the argument of the book in a nutshell. And here's a quick look at the table of contents. I begin with historical foundations of the field, going back to mainland China in the late 19th century, early 20th century, with the Republican, how the government, how the establishment of Peking University today, at the time, laid the foundation of the field and parsed into some of the earlier practitioners in the field, including people like Hu Shi, if you know about these early Chinese intellectuals. And the other section looks into the Japanese colonial period in Taiwan, focusing specifically on the currently National Taiwan University. At the time, was the Japanese, the Taihoku, the Taipei Imperial University, which is part of the Japanese Imperial University system. And then I zoom into the Cold War period to look at three cases: Xia Qian, Hou Jian, and Yan Yuanshu, three critical scholars in the 1960s who are fairly well known and have been fairly influential in various ways to look at how the Cold War was inscribed in their intellectual and critical practices. How their writing was very much a response to larger Cold War formation in the sense of introducing modernism and modernist aesthetics into Taiwan, but also to kind of work through the Civil War, the scars and traumas of the Civil War in terms of the Cold War the Taiwan-China division. And then comes part three, which is really when Taiwan opened up, thanks to the abolition of martial law in 1987, which came, an influx of foreign knowledges, particularly in foreign literature studies, context theory, critical theory, where we got to read people like Marx, Lacan, Spivak, Homi Bhabha, so on and so forth. And so I want to also take the time today to sort of talk about that transformative period in terms of how that translation of theory allow for a new articulation of the self, which is Taiwan. And with that, to bring together a way of understanding Cold War political history, from the vantage point of Taiwan's social transformation and this relationship to foreign literature studies. And ultimately, as you know, this is really a reflection of our own intellectual formation. So let me just give you a few summary points about the intentions of the project. It's really to historicize the presence through the institutional intellectual history of the discipline. And the reason for that is because, as you know, Taiwan has been going through a huge transformation from the 1990s onward. And even more so in recent years, there's a lot of dramatic, shakeup, this and that. I think with Ukraine going through the war, a lot of people are also thinking about Taiwan in those formations as well. So in that way, how does the cultural sphere reflect and represent to a certain extent the kind of geopolitical transformation of our time? It also is an attempt to understand the politics of knowledge in translingual, transpacific context, right? Given the fact that Taiwan was so closely aligned with the U.S., and many of us who taught in Taiwan, teach in Taiwan, most of us got a degree from the States, right? And also I think the project is really trying to make sense of, and here quotation marks, our Cold War experience is triangulated by U.S., China, and the I'm sorry for the typo here, and that is triangulated and also unending, meaning it's still ongoing. Right? The Cold War was proclaimed to be over in 1989, but in many parts of the world, it has not been the case. And the attempt to understand our Cold War experience is really also to bring back, that history of the Civil War as the continuous and unstabilizing force in the present. And finally, is really attempt to make sense of my own intellectual formation by foreign literature studies as articulated in the post-colonial, post-Cold War and minority paradigms by looking at moments of disjuncture. Such moments are colonial modernity, U.S. Cold War hegemony, and post-Cold War globalization. So some of the keywords to help you to sort of signpost, some of the arguments and progress of the narrative. So let me begin the second part of the talk with this quotation from Guo Songfen, who was also a Taida graduate, NTU graduate of this, the very good department that I graduated from, but also a very important modernist writer for those of you interested in Taiwanese literature. He is probably one person that you shouldn't miss. Another important part about him is that he was an activist when he was studying in UC Berkeley to be part of the Protect Our Itai movement. And he was, much of his sort of writing and thinking was influenced by existentialism, and also by a kind of reflection on the West. So the quotation was written in 1974 in a journal article called "On Taiwan's Literature," which is his sort of reflection on the development of Taiwan literature through a reflective sense of what the West has, through a reflection of how the West has influenced Taiwanese literature. So he argues, who was still stealing those feelings on the bookshelves of the West? Mostly the teachers and students of foreign literature studies, which means us. They immerse themselves in the bookshelves of the West, learn the ways Westerners feel and think, follow their decadent worldview of fin de siècle, and imitate their non-ridiculous and perverse gestures of being. And this obviously is a reference to, for example, the early modernist writers like Beckett, like Sartre, and so on and so forth. But the quotation sort of helps me to kind of stage the project in the sense that foreign literature needs to deal with its own history, right? Its own sort of Occidentalist history, a history that is so within the discipline that we sometimes forget that it's a history, it's our history rather than other people's history, and we need to kind of think critically about this historical formation. And this obviously leads us to the 1960s moment where the modernization of Taiwan was very much understood as Americanization, not so much in the sense of American occupation as you would have in Japanese context post 1945, but very much in a sort of tight connection, in a sort of in the form of what some scholars would call client state, in which Taiwan really received wholesale. Ideologically, materially, institutionally, and even in terms of infrastructure from the United States. And this really reflected in the curriculum in Taiwan, where new criticism was the motto, and that everybody has to read these new critics and be tested on them, as if that's the only way to do literature. Of course, there was a later invention that's displaced an earlier paradigm, but that also seemed to be the foundation of what we understand to be foreign literature studies today. And hence, Guo Songfen's sort of reference to chasing the Western gods, is a useful point of entry. If not chasing the Western gods, then chasing what? That becomes the question for us, right? And what are we chasing the Western gods for? And this, of course, has to be understood within the larger geopolitical context in which the Trans-Pacific Anti-Communist Front was very much forged, along, ideologically speaking, with the introduction of Western modernism in foreign literature studies and the kind of anti-communist imagination in Chinese studies. And I'll get into this part very quickly in the sense that Chinese studies, or primarily Chinese literature studies, is actually very closely connected with foreign literature studies as such. And this, of course, also has to do with the sort of a larger reframing of the Cold War, right? If it has not ended, then how to have it transition, and particularly in Taiwan, it has transitioned in terms of Taiwan's self-identity from Free China in the 1960s to sort of post-colonial Taiwan, right? And this, I guess, is the foundation in which Taiwan studies today has built itself. So therefore, there's a move to descend to China from the 90s onward, as well as an attempt to minoritize Taiwan, and hence both of which requires a re-articulation of Taiwan's subjectivity as 主体性. So this is the gist of the argument I have here. So let me begin by Xia Qian. He's a very well-known scholar in a way today if you are in the discipline of Taiwanese literature. He would be someone that you have to face, not as necessarily a model to learn from, but as a part of history that has shaped Taiwan literature. Because he, in 1956, established this journal called 文学杂志, which inspired a generation of young writers associated with a journal called Modern Literature, including such writers as Bai Xianyong, Song Su, Wang Wenxin, and various others, Chen Ruixi. And these writers then became the foundation of modern Taiwanese literature, which ironically has a lot of associations, and they're sort of nostalgia for mainland China on the one hand, but also their sort of experiences being a diasporic in the United States. Last but not least, he is also the older brother of Xia Ziqing, the author of the influential History of Modern Chinese Fiction, who was teaching in Columbia before he passed away. And Xia Ziqing too was a very foundational figure in modern Chinese literature. So sort of to kind of think of the brothers together allows you to kind of open up a transpacific network of intellectuals where people in different disciplines, Chinese, English, actually converged around these people, right? And what is also interesting is that the convergence allows us, the convergence reveals a deep connection between the Cold War project, through funding in the United States on modern Chinese studies in the 1960s onwards, and these intellectuals who were trained initially as foreign literature scholars, then turned into modern Chinese literature. So in a way, the kind of irony we have today is for people like me, who were trained in foreign literature studies and now somehow doing Taiwan studies, right? Which is a similar sort of transition, but I guess it only speaks to how the time has changed geopolitically and culturally. So I want to show you a little bit of Xia Qian to sort of situate the problematic of the Cold War and why our experience of the Cold War matters. Okay, this is a quotation from his diary written in 1947, right after China at the time under the Republic of China, KMT, won the war against Japan, but also in the midst of fighting a war with communists. And he said he was having read Africa themes on that grounds, I thought that modern literature evolved along internal and external tendencies. The internal tendency investigates the interiority culminating in the work of James Joyce, and external tendency shells out slogans and calls for revolution, becoming leftist writers. These two tendencies have tipped literature off balance, and that is why modern literature lacks truly great works. This was written when he was roughly less than 30 years, 20 something. And he was trying to kind of make sense of, how the Western literature has influenced Chinese literature, particularly the May 4th generation. And his criticism of the May 4th generation is that it has taken a romantic tendency from the West and turned that into a revolutionary zeal, right? So literature was, in that sense, impure. It was politicized. It was a form of propaganda. And therefore, for modern Chinese literature to find its own lifeline, it needs to get away from that sort of political influence and return, literature to literature. Just as a little side note, and this is very interesting for anyone who was training in the discipline of foreign literature studies, is that he thought at the time, what his ambition is actually to become the #1 person writing in English, right? Which again is going back to the language training component, and then to publish, abroad, right? Because that's, that would be considered to be a rare achievement, which in many ways really paved the way of our career. So I teased out from his letters, the letters between Xia Jie and Xia Zixi, the two brothers, written from 1940s all the way to 1965 when he passed away in Berkeley, where they actually, exchange a lot of opinions about various things, including their views on literature. So this is a quotation from one of the letters written in 1951. TA Hsia became the person he admires most, and his ambition is, and this he refers to Xia Jie, is to create and lead an anti-May 4th movement, to advocate classicism to counter the May 4th romanticism. So as May 4th romanticism is about to decline with the demolition of Chinese communism, this sort of hopeful vision, right? That, the communist China is going to go away because, what should I probably just keep? Okay, because he thought, that's going to go away. So there's a lot of hope that, Chinese literature can be resurrected into a different form. And for that, he argues that, Chinese literature would need a new theoretical guidance. So he aspires to write a book on Romanticism and Classicism to introduce the classicist movement of the 20th century and to provide some constructive advice on Chinese literature. And he further on, very quickly, he argues that China has its own tradition, and to establish that requires serious research on poetry, calligraphy, Peking opera, and martial arts. Right? Once again, pretty much everything that we were brought into the fold of modern Chinese studies or Taiwan studies in a certain way, and this can be a work for a lifetime. And what is interesting is that in this theorization or argument, he's really looking at a sort of individually based literature, a kind of individually based imagination in understanding what literature is and can do. Okay, which again is very much in opposition to the communist view of literature, as following the Ying'an talk. Literature literature has to follow the party's rule and to speak for the revolution, if you will. So fundamentally, I think what I'm getting at, with these quotations, really to tease out this notion of politics against politics, in which the study of literature, the literature that's influenced through the West, by the West, is a version of literature that can be free from ideology, right? And this obviously is a kind of ideology, but this sort of politically free ideology or politics against politics has to be understood within this Civil War context, right? Which is doubled up, by the Cold War, in the sense that Taiwan and China were separated and as rivals. So just one last bit to hinge on what he thinks, is the kind of literature that is that can create a politics against politics is this quotation. He says, novelists may have a whole set of ideals for social reform, but novelists must make his work, novelists, I'm sorry for the typo, must make his work different from propaganda. Novelists should be interested in the nebulous boundaries of between good and evil, where it is hard to tell the good from the evil, and where the reversive stories of the prodigal son and the fallen hero are precious experience of life. In this sense, literature can be reformative and restorative, but it doesn't have to be, or it shouldn't be revolutionary. Right? So this is the kind of aesthetic politics, if you will, that he holds up, to think about the Cold War in the context of the Civil War. With this, let's move on to the next section in the 1990s, where these three people, all of them are my teachers, engaged in a debate about Taiwanese subjectivity. It was a fairly heated debate in the 1990s in such journals, 中外文学, 中外 Literary Monthly, which interestingly was, at the time publishing 12 issues per year. So every single month they have an issue, which facilitated a sort of heated discussion in a way. But the fundamental argument is that in the 1990s, because of the abolition of the martial laws, there began a trend or a movement of nativization, which is pushing for a separatist imagination that Taiwan is politically and culturally not China. Post-colonial discourses ushered in and legitimated a discussion of the Republic of China as a foreign regime and a colonial state. Okay, and I think this we're still sort of in that influence today. Crucially, this post-colonial era is entangled with the post-Cold War moment, right? Remember 1987 and 1989, where Western theory rushed into into Taiwan in full force. Taiwan entered an age of theory, so to speak, where the question of subjectivity and identity set up the political and cultural agendas in the coming decades. In Cho Hui-Fen's words, the lady in the middle, in the previous picture, we will use the post-colonial strategy of cultural hybridity to dislodge Taiwan from the historical mode of post-colonial politics by creating a community of destiny and a culture that is based on Taiwanese subject. And it is through this article that he published in 1992 that this question of the subject gets picked up, as the center of the debate, right? Which, in a nutshell, the question is that what kind of subject is Taiwan, and how can Taiwan become a subject, right? Which is, so this is what I hope to sort of elucidate in my talk below. So in response to Cho Hui-Fen's sort of position about the importance of subjectivity, Liao Caoyang responded, by saying that sort of post-colonial hybridity is insufficient, because that sort of view would obscure, if not erase, the power dynamic of the colonizer and the colonized, right? And this, hybridity discourse is really was really popular in the 1990s in post-colonial theory, and people really took it seriously as a kind of political strategy in formulating what Taiwan could be or could have become. Contrary to the psychoanalytic notion of subjectivity as a state of subjection, Liao Caoyang here builds his model of subjectivity in the Enlightenment thinking to emphasize positive awareness of the self, as self-consciously blank. Liao writes, blank subjectivity is a unit or form of existence. In the objective material conditions, life is open to the flow of experience, and it is a space where such experiences are received and stored. Blankness does not exclude contents. Rather, it receives and changes contents and gives meaning to contents. Namely, subjectivity must constantly move contents in so as to prove and establish that it can move contents out. It is why it is absolute. Thus, blankness of subjectivity is equal to the lack in psychoanalysis. If you're in, English department, this last sentence will probably catch your attention, and I may have to spend another hour explaining, why they are relevant or not. But I'll skip that. Really to simply, draw your attention to this formulation of the blankness, which is theoretically different from the Western version of subjectivity, and has a very local implication when it's articulated as black. I'm sorry, not black, but blank. So in this view, the laws, culture, so if you look at Western theory of subjectivity as subjection, you would be looking at the force of the law and the culture and how it formed, the subject. But rather, Liao Cao has taken a different way to look at subjectivity as a public space for communication and change, right? And he argues this: just as it is wrong for babies to assume mothers to be part of themselves, when babies are forced to separate from mothers, mothers in an abstract sense take on diverse forms to fill in the blankness left by separation. So this is referring to the babies who are growing up, get into in their becoming an adult. There's a lot of loss and compensation. And what in fact substitutes the mother, sometimes a septic blanket will do, is determined by historical contingencies. And we should note here that this is really a metaphorical gesture rather than a literal discussion. And yet this metaphorical gesture allows him to make a certain transposition into the Taiwanese reality. So he uses the metaphor of the cup and water to explain, why the subject needs to be blamed. Because if the subject does not have an identity, it is like holding a cup with a cup, right? So only have the subject, but there's no content there. So it's the cup in the cup, which is unrealistic. To have only identity without subjectivity is like holding water with water, which results in the expansion of a certain reality, allowing it to become a fetishized obsession. So a subjectivity is plain and thus rational and public. It must be capable of moving identity in and out of itself, so as to adjust the relationship between the interior and the external. Right? And what I'm getting at is that, let me finish this last bit. And so in Liao Cao's discussion, there's a reference to the reality in Taiwan, in the sense that in the 1990s, Taiwan, the KMT government at the time still proclaimed that, the Republic of China government has ruled territorially, over mainland China, including what appears on the map, those red areas, right? So in the older days, we call it Chouhaitang. But the PRC has a different map, which sometimes we jokingly call it Lao Muji, right? So Liao Cao was arguing that whether it's Lao Muji or Chouhaitang, whether it's a begonia or the old hen, it doesn't match with the reality of Taiwan. The subject needs to find a balance between the external and the interior, right? And therefore, what this ends up actually saying is that the subject is already determined to be Taiwan rather than anything else. Okay. So his colleague Liao Xianhao responded to Liao Cao's theorization, saying that Liao Cao could say so only because he is not attentive to history and identity, basically feelings, people's feelings about being in the society, having a history longer than the current politics. So he argues that humans are animals of history. To have a history is to have feelings. Histories and feelings can be understood rationally, but cannot be cancelled out by reason. Liao Cao ignores the dimension of history in subjectivity, so he could speak of subjectivity as a cup that can empty the dirty water within. That is why he could speak of the effects of subjectivity without feelings. This view is not only innocent, but also hegemonic. If I can be blank, why can't you? it must be because you don't love Taiwan. And this obviously is a part of that political debate at the time, which is being constructed along this loving Taiwan, hating, not loving Taiwan kind of discourse. So what we get at from this debate is really to get a sense of this translation of subjectivity, in fact, is an invention of subjectivity as a variable. What was a theoretical discourse about being turns into a political discourse about value, right? So blank subjectivity is an invention. Defining Taiwan as a post-colonial space determined Taiwanese rather than Chinese as the normative subject that is now ready to choose its own destiny. The Taiwanese subjectivity is hardly blank to begin with. It is that assumed blankness that instilled in subjectivity a certain political imagination, a certain kind of self-awareness that allows itself to be moved out of Chinese subjectivity by emptying out its Chinese contents, identity, and feeling. It invented a Taiwanese subjectivity as a positive value through translation. So I hope this is clear. The story that I'm getting at is clear to you. And with that, I think I just want to end the talk by raising a few larger questions that I think the book is interested in, but didn't quite go into that direction. So this is really a sort of post-book development, if you will. The three questions are like this. How do we understand knowledge transmission within co-work circuits and against co-work division, right? To think about, Xiaoqian's situation. A recent book by Ginny Watson, Co-work Reckonings, sort of deal with this similar problematic. How do we understand intersections of post-colonialism and co-work politics, which is oftentimes not, talked about in the same breath? So are they oppositional or actually co-constitutive, right? And this would obviously be a response to the discussion of cultural Cold War, which oftentimes focus on, the USIS, the Free Asia Society, and so on and so forth, to kind of think about US influence through a certain cultural agencies, but not so much, through a kind of discursive re-articulation of the time and politics. Furthermore, how to translate Taiwanese subjectivity into global theories. And this is obviously what scholars like Susume is trying to do with Sinophone Taiwan theory, their effort to relocate Taiwan in post-colonial, subaltern, queer, diasporic, and transnational discourses. And I think with these questions would also help us kind of think about Taiwan studies, which I believe is a project that's been taken on here in GW. In the sense that Taiwan is moving from a project of differentiation, saying that we are not China, to a form or to a politics of recognition that the international world needs to recognize Taiwan as Taiwan, and what that means. Also, it needs to kind of move away, from normative subjectivity, as in the case that we discussed just now, to a sort of relational community of understanding itself, which means Taiwan is not merely, a state of Taiwanese. There are also other people living in that space in relation to various other spaces, not just mainland China, but also Southeast Asia, US, Japan, so on and so forth. So how do we kind of think about Taiwan in those kind of relational economy rather than a normative subjectivity that has a pretty strict boundaries? And finally, I think it also helps us kind of think about the question of knowledge production in shifting force fields, right? How history shaped knowledge, basically, particularly the imprints of time and the location of people. So I want to sort of end my talk here with these larger reflections and share with you, and hopefully invite you to the conversation as well. Thank you very much.
All right. So yeah, thank you so much, Professor Wang, for this really wonderful talk. I will have to say that 45 minutes isn't really enough to cover the really broad scope included in this particular book. And I think you started out, actually today's talk only covered a few chapters of your book. And aside from that, you also, in the first part of your book, you trace the development of the discipline to early 20th century. And also the two origins, one from mainland China and the other one, the history of foreign literature as a discipline in Taiwan. So hopefully, we actually have a question from a audience member asking whether some of these chapters will be translated into English in the future, and hopefully that will happen soon. So today, I have to say that I also came from Taiwan. I studied at Taiwan University, but I got an MA in drama and theater studies. So foreign literature is a discipline that I've always, when I was there, I've always wanted to be part of it, but I wasn't able to because of all kinds of reasons. But then I have to say that I benefit a lot from those who studied and who taught in the Department of Foreign Literature. So people like Hu Yaoheng, Zhu Jingmei, Ju Zhenrong, they all got their training from either NTU or somewhere else. And also a lot of them actually did their advanced study in the US. So that's something, after reading your book, reflecting back, I will have to say that I probably also, gain a lot of insights from their trainings. But then today, we actually have some of you, actually, perhaps you were also part of it if you have a tie with Taiwan. I know that my colleague, Alexa Jubin, has you told me that earlier that you have a question that you have for Andy. Yeah, so would you want to? Yeah.
Hey, thank you for your talk. This is much wonderful. I also study in Taiwan, and I'm a product like you of the foreign language studies department. I was just thinking through your grand history. I think Taiwan has always had this identity crisis, which has defined Taiwan studies, and that's also makes Taiwan one of the most fascinating places. As you hinted at the end, it doesn't really fit conveniently into any single category in terms of theorization, diaspora, transnational, Sinophone. None of those were even post-colonial really adequately define Taiwan as a society, as a place, as a sovereign nation in the world. But recent events have really, I think, are really changing that from the protest in Hong Kong a few years ago, with the pandemic, the Ukrainian war. More and more Taiwanese, according to surveys, identify themselves as Taiwanese as a freestanding category, a Chinese-speaking location, but somehow they're Taiwanese. The pro-Japanese sentiment continues, which is, of course, very unique for post-colonial location. Culturally, a lot of Taiwanese artists and people, they are very much drawn to Japanese aesthetics and sentiments without feeling any contradiction. The culture of the former colonizers, well, one of the latest colonizers, there have been many colonizers in Taiwan. So with all these changes, if you can look into your crystal ball, I wonder where you see foreign literature studies and Taiwan studies and the place of Taiwan going in the future. Is it this further distancing from anything Chinese? The anti-Chinese sentiment, of course, has always been there, but I see it growing really strong. Lately, would Taiwan begin to enter a post-colonial path? Perhaps the kind of decolonization would take the form of de-Sinicization. Where do you see it going? Since you're based there and you are so prolific, you're actually observing things on the ground. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alexa. It's a great question and a very hard one to answer. Let me try it by tackling this in two fronts. The first part is actually a statement of positioning, in the sense that for Taiwan to be a democratic, progressive, not a party, democratic, progressive society, it needs to open itself up to the world, right? So the whole discussion about Taiwan in the world in Taiwan, and I think the foreign literature studies really embodies that spirit from the earlier moments. And therefore, so the statement is that for Taiwan in the future, Taiwan needs to be more part of the world, more in relation to the world, but also to be more cognitive of other parts of the world, not just the United States and Japan, but seriously, Ukraine, I guess, is gaining a lot of traction recently in Taiwan. But that's also a kind of sad story, right? Because kind of 15 minutes of fame is actually articulated with a certain trauma and war. So I think, in terms of practice, I think that would be the direction for Taiwan to go further, not merely foreign literature studies, but I think foreign literature study would be a unique site for extending that worldly purview into other spaces. And this also is part of the sort of internal debate in the discipline, because as you see, I mean, the mandate is to teach Northern anthology, and so where do you find the energy and resources and manpower to also get into spaces like Afghanistan, Armenia, and all these other spaces, right? So this goes back to this Cold War formation in the sense of understanding Taiwan also as a form of area studies, and to use area studies sort of, not so much the Cold War baggage of it, but rather the sort of disciplinary and pedagogical tool it provides, to do deep study and research on certain areas that are always articulated with where we are, right? So that will be the first part. The second part would simply just to say, that's exactly the question you raised, is exactly the issue people are trying to kind of figure out. With Taiwan Studies being sort of a new initiative, I guess, in mostly in the States, but also in Europe. I think the current government, but also the government before, really wants to kind of relocate Taiwan in this larger, nexus of connections. And in that sense, I think China remains important. Despite, I think people would have different opinions when the question of China comes up, both here, but also probably in Zoom and other spaces. But wherever you stand on the issue, I think China remains, a potent and powerful force that Taiwan has to reckon with. So to entirely disengage itself from it, I don't think is necessary to move. Instead, we need to have more understanding of what China is and about. So that would be it. Thank you.
So it's about 5. The floor is now open for anybody who is interested in asking a question to Professor Wang. So if you are here, then I encourage you to just raise your hand, and Amanda or Malene will take the mic to you. Okay, and if you are joining us via Zoom, feel free to enter your questions or comments via the chat box, and then I will ask the question on your behalf. Okay, we actually have a few. We have some good friends joining us from all over the globe. So already 2 questions came in. Okay, so but then I also have a question that I'm just I'd like to ask before we move on to the Zoom audience's questions. So, I'm really curious, especially because the two books, your first book and the second book, both touch upon the metaphor of traveling. Okay, so your first book, Transpacific Articulations, focuses on Chinese studying abroad Chinese students' journey and how they would imagine them having influence in the various disciplines they are practicing. And I wonder if there are possible ways to talk about the connection between your first book and the second book. Did the first one lead to the second one? And if so, in what ways?
Okay. Thank you, Leanna, for this wonderful and really interesting question. I have thought about it. And I think there are some connections. I think the connection lies in this sort of almost narcissistic obsession about being a foreign student and what it means. So the earlier project really to kind of understand the foreign student in the context of Asian American context. Foreign students are oftentimes the first generation. They were deemed as sort of non-existent, culturally speaking, in Asian American, communities. So I want to kind of dig into, their social activism, their writings in Chinese as a way to offer this other dimension of the immigrant generation and their contribution to Asian American society. So that was the gist of the first book. And so in relation to that, I think I'm also looking at their sort of impact on Taiwan or Chinese-speaking community in general when these first-generation immigrants somehow manage to come back, and particularly in the arena of intellectual production. Because I think Western-educated scholars or intellectuals have been the key force in Taiwan's development. Both technocrats, entrepreneurs, scholars and teachers, even people in the nursing, public health industry. I mean, there's just so many connections to this outside world. We need to acknowledge that, both intellectually, but also to acknowledge that geopolitically, right? I mean, why do we get so many doses of Moderna for free and so fast in delivery than the ones that we actually bought, with our budget? That is a question to be raised, and that has to be understood in this larger geopolitical, situations. Yeah. I guess the second project, which is the current book, I could talk a little bit about its genesis. Its genesis was really in 2011, when the Taiwanese government actually, under the Ma Ying-jeou administration, orchestrated an exhibit of humanities in Taiwan, which invited all different disciplines to participate for curation of the show, for the exhibition. And it's interesting that the Taiwan studies people did not participate in this project because the way the program was set up is that it's a century-long intellectual trajectory and tradition. And so in a way, it's a very sort of unbalanced assemblage of the century, of century-long history. But what it got me thinking is that how difficult it is actually to curate a show about discipline, right? Because it requires your really good, documentation about what happened before, and we really didn't have much of that, right? And you not only need the documentation of what happened, but also you need an analytical lens into what happened. And so I think these were the genesis of why this project came into being, because I feel that somebody got to fill in the blank and leave a little stepping stone for the future generation.
Talking about documentation, one thing I find very interesting is that in the book you actually rely on, to some extent, I think this this applies to when you are discussing the study of the colonial era Taiwan, okay, the study of foreign literature, and also at the back, at the end of the book, you also have an appendix listing the topics of master thesis and dissertations completed by those who study. I don't know the time span, but it's a really impressive, it's a pretty long list. So this brings me to think a very important actor in the field, in that field of foreign literature studies, which is the students. Okay, I wonder, and also towards the end of your book, you kind of envision, the directions where foreign language as a discipline, foreign literature as a discipline could go. So I wonder if you can take a few minutes to talk about those visions that you have for the future, for the next generation.
Well, thank you for that. Yet another challenging question. In fact, when I did my first actually talked about the book before the book was published, I got questions from the floor, mostly from teachers teaching in the department, saying that, you want us to go to Afghanistan, you want to go to Armenia, you do it. We're not going to do it. And this obviously is a joke, right? But I think it also says a lot about this kind of suspicion about this more sort of, dare I say, an articulation of foreign literature studies with international studies, right? And I understand this would not be implemented, on the ground very easily. It requires a lot of restructuring, reshuffling of the program and the intellectual capacity that supports it. But I think that the general vision is that, the Taiwan society and the country needs a wider view of the world. Right? And I think it's out of that, sort of impulse that I made this sort of fairly daring and perhaps insubstantial suggestion. In that sense, we probably shouldn't look at it most only on the sort of pedagogical context, but we need to kind of see it, as a strategy, as a way of engaging, knowledge about Taiwan and knowledge about the world. The other part about the students, which also is very interesting. I mean, the appendix is really just a 20-year list of thesis and dissertations published on any topics on Asian American studies. Because Asian American studies, this is the topic for chapter 8, since 1990s has been sort of becoming mainstreamed in foreign literature studies. A lot of the discussion about Amy Tan, Mason Kinston, onwards. There's a little drop recently, in the last 5 to 6 years. There didn't seem to be as much interest in this. But Asian American as a category is a transnational flexible category that is all part of Taiwan, if I may say so. A lot of people actually, have a transnational family life, right? Summer here in Taiwan, the other 2 semesters in DC, for instance. And therefore, the way to sort of tackle this question about the Asian American is really also a way to tackle this relationship, right? The US-Asia relationship. To look at the Asian American as a category, both of translation in terms of how we think about ethnicity in Taiwan, right? How Asian American studies as ethnic studies program, once transplanted into Taiwan, what does it do, right? If it's not merely about literature, what can it do, right? So there's a little bit of discussion about the Institute of Social Transformation at Sishin University, initiated and established by Lucy Chen, former sociologist at UCLA, that dedicated the whole department to a study of migrant worker in Taiwan. So the translation, from question of ethnicity to transnational labor is really interesting. And that also sort of goes along with my vision of how foreign literature studies can re-articulate itself for these other ends. And so finally, the students I think are critical because they are the subject being more morphed and forged, right? So if you look at the Japanese colonial era, I was so totally surprised by the fact that these students were so well trained. And they were able to write not only critically, but also knowingly about the political situation at the time, when Japan was, from 1928 to 1943, there's a huge change in terms of what Japan was. And they were able to sort of work that into their study of, say, Tessa D'Urberville, Mary Wollstonecraft, that sort of thing, right? So that again helps me to kind of see how foreign literature studies, not merely as a study of the West, but actually as an archive to understand how Taiwan, in this case, transformed or experienced, its imprints of time.
Questions from the floor? I have two questions from the Zoom chat room. So one from Shelley Chan. Hi, Andy. Thanks for the great talk. To what extent foreign literature study might have been a diasporic construction of China, quote unquote, rooted in the proponents' experiences in both the US and Taiwan? And then a second question. Could we also understand what happened in the 1990s as a series of counter-diasporic constructions? But one still in conversation with the US, if not China? Does Southeast Asia appear in your research?
Well, thank you very much, Shelley. It's been a long time. I hope you can hear me. Thank you for the two great questions. Let me take the last one first. There is a Southeast Asian component to it, and it's still currently in Taiwan at this moment in the name of Malaysian Chinese literature. So we actually have quite a number of Malaysian Chinese scholars working in Taiwan in the foreign literature studies departments. How did they come here? How did they come to Taiwan? Right? This is actually a very interesting question because during the Cold War era, Malaysia and Taiwan, I should break it off by saying there's a substantial Chinese community in Malaysia, but Chinese education was not accepted as much in the Malaysian educational system. There is a separate parallel school, but there was also a period of time when Chinese schools were repressed. So Taiwan became a natural circuit for them, for Malaysian Chinese students if they want to pursue a higher degree. Because at that time during the Cold War, China was entirely blocked out of their vision. Okay, so these Malaysian Chinese students came to Taiwan to study, got a degree in Taiwan, and then stayed to become professors. They become writers too, to write in Chinese about Malaysia. They also become scholars in Taiwan to think and write about and theorize in Malaysian Chineseness, which is also recognized as part of the foreign literature studies formation. Right. So this is the part about Southeast Asia, which again has to be understood through this kind of Cold War formation. The first part I didn't quite understand, but based on what I got, I think the question is really about China, and to what extent these foreign literature scholars tackle their own Chineseness, both in history but also in language and culture, I guess. And I think that if you look at Hsia Jian's case carefully, you will know that these people are very well immersed in traditional Chinese culture. their education in the West, or in Western in Western literature, is meant to help them to do better in Chinese literature, right? And that is really the fundamental gist of this generation of scholars, meaning the generation in the 1990s. I'm sorry, in the 1960s and 70s. They still carry the memory of mainland China. A lot of them actually came from mainland China. The way they practice at a time called Chinese Western comparison is really to use Western theory and categories to elaborate what Chinese literature is and can be. For instance, the question about whether there is an epic in China, right? Why, or how should, whether the actual framing is actually why there isn't an epic tradition in Chinese literature, right? Or how do we think about the lyrical, in the Chinese literature? This is the work of Chen Sixiang and various others in Chinese literature department, including Gao Yonggong and currently Wang Dewei. So the China question is still there, but with the 1990s and the nationalization movement onwards, that question about the Chineseness gets displaced to a certain extent. It has not disappeared; it's still here and there, but it gets more contested, right? And that is why people in Taiwanese literature departments would be a little bit hesitant or ambivalent about these earlier generations of writers such as Mai Xianyong, Chen Ruoxi, in the sense that they may have too much Chineseness, if you will, and not enough Taiwaneseness, right? And if we're really dividing them in terms of having in the mainland Chinese enough hanjinliang, enough quality to be a Taiwanese, then we're actually missing out a lot of our history, right? And that again is how we need to kind of retake the question of Chineseness in the current Taiwanese context.
I'd like to solicit again any questions from the actual floor. And please let us know who you are.
Oh, of course. My name is Mark. I'm a student here at GW, and also a member of the TERP Fellowship. I'd have to say it was a fantastic presentation, but I did have a question about domestic Taiwanese literature and its reception abroad. How have other countries responded to these increasing efforts to expand Taiwanese literature outside Taiwan's own borders and across oceans to other countries?
Can you say the last bit again? How the Taiwanese?
Oh, how have other countries responded to an influx of Taiwanese literature? Has it been positive, negative? What have responses been?
Oh, okay. Thank you, but I don't feel that I'm in a position to answer that in a way that I have not followed on this question specifically. But what I can say is that there has not been as much translated in terms of Taiwanese literature. There's been a lot of efforts, I think, since the 90s through Qi and Wang Dewei with their collaboration with Columbia University Press. And earlier, in Taiwan, when Qi was still the head of the translation bureau, they made an effort to translate Taiwanese literature, quote unquote Taiwanese literature at the time in the 70s internationally. There's also a journal called Chinese Pen, which I believe is recently renamed into something Taiwan Pen or whatnot. But that has been, I think, the most important venue for having access to Taiwanese literature in translation. So what I can say is that there has been a lot of efforts in doing that, and I think the government is aware of the usefulness of the soft power. But I can't say much about the response. I think most of the response, if any, is actually the people in East Asian studies taking up Taiwanese literature as a subject of study. And I think that is indeed seemingly on the rise. Oftentimes coupled with an interest in films, right? So the 1980s, Hou Xiaoxian, Yang Decang, and I think recently, Wei Deshen and various others seem to provide a lot of fodder for interest. So I think that's probably ticking up, but how that would spin out, I think it remains to be seen. But thank you for that question.
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Cleo, associate editor at the Washington Quarterly here at the Elliott School. I guess my question sort of echoes previous questions, but I was wondering if you could speak a bit about how various waves of Chinese intellectuals who left or fled the mainland have affected the discourse around constructing a Taiwanese identity that's, if not separate, then at least untangles itself from a larger Chinese identity.
Thank you for that question, Cleo. I would say this is really there is a generational difference. So, for example, when I came out here to study in late 90s, early 2000s, it was still very easy to just call yourself a Chinese. But I think that the situation has changed to the extent that the labeling has a lot of implications and consequences. Just in the sense, like people would say, "Oh, I can hear your accent," this and that. Particularly during the pandemic, I guess there was some kind of effort to strongly identify you as a Taiwanese, just to stay out of trouble for being labeled as a Chinese. In terms of these writers, I think in the 1970s generation, I don't think there is a clear distinction between Taiwanese and Chinese. I don't think there are conflicting identities. It was totally fine for Bai Tianyong, obviously, to see himself as a Chinese writer coming from Taiwan. There would be, for example, pro-independence activists and writers that would more strongly identify with Taiwanese-ness. People that you will find in the sort of Taiwanese American communities, through FAPA or various other organizations, even passing down to the second generation, third generation, seeing themselves, speaking only Taiwanese, basically Southern Min dialect at home, and not so much Mandarin Chinese. So there will be another sort of distinction. In terms of writers, I think from the 90s onwards, particularly the younger generation, this generation of sort of intellectual scholars, directors, actors, I think there will be a stronger sense of identifying themselves as Taiwanese. How much of that has been an impact internationally, I am not so clear at this moment. For instance, my own experience here in the States is that I don't think there is a strong distinction among the people, about who you are in terms of Taiwan or China. But if you're within the community, within the group, you sort of automatically detect, the in-group and out-group. So that is a tense question, but how that would help for Taiwan to be more clearly recognized globally, in the international, geopolitical context, I think remains to be seen.
So I would like to thank Chris Lucky for providing us with the correct, the title, the new title of the government-sponsored the journal that translates Taiwanese literary works, Taipei Chinese Pen.
That's right. Taipei Chinese.
So I have another question from the Zoom audience, Franz K, who asks, what spaces became available after the lifting of the martial law for exchanges between scholars of foreign literature on both sides of the Taiwan Straits? And how have comparative studies of foreign literature studies on both sides influenced the study of FLS in Taiwan since the end of the Cold War?
The last sentence.
How have the comparative studies of FLS on both sides and then Taiwan influenced the study of FLS in Taiwan since the end? Yeah. So
Well, thank you very much for that question. There, I would say after the 90s, there's there was a moment of growing interaction. Let me put it this way: there was a moment of growing interaction between mainland scholars and Taiwanese scholars in the field of foreign literature studies. However, the convergence of the two remains to be very minimal, in the sense that for two reasons. One is that the positive side is that there is a convergent interest in Asian American studies, which in Taiwan would at one point be considered sort of a mainstream tendency, but in mainland China has always been a minority. Okay. Because mainland China since 1952 was the restructuring of their educational structure, Western literature for the longest time was not a proper subject to study until the late 70s, early 80s, right, with the reform and open and reform policies. So there was a picking up on Western literature in mainland China. And particularly the sort of institutionalized form of studying. Now they have all these different associations in mainland China on, say, ancient literature, American literature, and they would invite Taiwanese scholars to participate in that as well. However, the way we practice are fairly different because. There's, as all of you know, there's not much room for the PRC scholars to really engage with problems that are more contemporary, that are more sort of socially relevant. And therefore, a lot of the foreign literature studies in mainland China would either focus on canonical texts or a particular period that is removed from the current. And therefore, those people who are interested in Asian American studies is actually a rare minority worthy of associating with. However, with the current situation between the straits, that sort of possibility of connection and working together gets diminished. Unfortunately, at least in the last 2 years or so.
Please tell us who you are.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for the great talk. My name is Richard, and I work here in DC. I found your talk quite illuminating, but I kind of wanted to dig in a bit about the political aspects of literary studies in Taiwan, and even dating back to the early days before I was in Taiwan, like in the Republic of China. It seems that from your earlier talk, you kind of mentioned that there was a push at a point where people kind of wanted to go back to a purist form of literature that's not as political. Has it been proven, or in your mind, is there such a thing as that type of literature that can be separated from the politics? How much does agency of the literary authors have to do with what they put out, or is it always going to be in some shape or form a product of their time? What's your own opinion on this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's a good question. I wasn't able to unpack entirely about Xiajian, but Xiajian is really a really interesting case to kind of think about this question that you raised. For him, literature, the politics of literature has to be anti-politics, and the two politics in this phrase do not mean exactly the same thing. Okay, he wouldn't use the word politics of literature. I think, going back to his, diary and various other publications. I don't think that really is what the kind of category that he operates with. But he is definitely anti the kind of propaganda, ideological co-optation of literature. Okay, and what is interesting in this formulation is also an internal critique of Taiwan government at the time by under KMT that it also tries to kind of control literary activity and shape it in a certain direction. That would seem entirely, it would seem highly ideological, even though it doesn't explicitly say so, right? So, for example, the anti-communist kind of literature would be understood in the sort of realist fashion, as a form of realism, but it's highly ideologically at center. So that again, in other words, Xiaqian's sort of politics against politics, my summary of it, actually goes both ends, right? And that is why his position as a diasporic here in the States is really interesting, because one of the reasons that he left Taiwan was because he was so worried about being embroiled into political scene that he might say something, truly to himself, but get taken away, twisted into a different meaning, and therefore got into trouble, politically speaking. He thought being in the States, he could be more of himself, saying what he wants. But as a foreign literature scholar, someone who trained in Western Romantics, he wasn't able to land on any job teaching, say, British poetry, English literature. He landed a job at the Center for Chinese Studies at UC Berkeley, working with Chen Sixiang on a project of studying China, which is a way to study PRC newspapers and create a list of categories. I should say a list of vocabulary, to understand the situation in China, right? Which, in other words, means he became, on one hand, a Chinese studies person, on the other hand, furthering a project of anti-communism, right? Which will probably be okay in Taiwan, right? Being an anti-communist, but he also wanted that distance away from that kind of political pressure. At the same time, to stay close to China in some sense, right? So to me, he is very fascinating because he really is the kind of person that navigates different structures of knowledge while holding the politics in a very sort of central position, yet played it out to be fairly neutral and disinterested.
Well, we're almost time, so I guess we'll have to conclude here. So I want to thank you, Professor Wang, once again for your really engaging presentation, and thank you all for participating in the conversation. If you are here, please join us after the event for a little bit of meet and greet with Professor Wang. I'd also like to thank those of you who joined us from our Zoom platform. If you missed part of the presentation, we will make our recordings available on the TERP's website. If you can post again the link to the TERP website to the Zoom audience, that would be great. So thank you all for participating. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, both here and also online. Thank you very much for having me here.